Have you ever stopped to think that ideals don't change, that they simply evolve, that we can learn from our history and from the legendary heroes and mountain men who helped shape our nation? Today, I bring you a different kind of episode, something more personal, a reflection on our past, on how we're beginning to long once again for what we once had, how most of the country wants to make America great again. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. And now, let's begin with blood and broken treaties. Then we can understand why rifles and revival meetings went hand in hand. Chapter 1. Frontier Ethos: Guns, God, and Community. They spoke of their country like you'd speak of family. A quiet fire burned in their chests. This was 19th century America. Loyalty ran deep. Folks believed their young nation stood apart, and that belief gave them strength. They called it manifest destiny, a phrase that felt like thunder rolling across the plains. It told them they were meant to push west, to plant flags on every ridge. From the Louisiana Purchase to the Mexican lands, they watched the maps grow. Each mile held pride. They felt special, that their ways, their freedom, their talk of progress were gifts the world needed. Writers, painters, thinkers joined in. They tried to sketch a culture all their own. The Hudson River School captured wide skies and lone trees. Transcendentalists chased truth in the woods. Old songs passed from mouth to mouth, turning strangers into kin. Far off, Europe felt its own stirrings. Machines roared in cities. People longed for voices at the table. They claimed language and customs as shields. They marched for borders and banners, for a place to call home. But that same clamoring could turn dark. Some shut out others. Minorities found doors slammed in their faces. Back here, however, the frontier held its own lessons. Life on the edge forged grit. You learned to trust your hands and your heart. You leaned on neighbors, but kept to yourself. Frederick Jackson Turner said the frontier shaped the American soul, that it made it hungry, free, and tough. Later, folk called it individualism. And here's a hard truth for you. You shaped and forged your path, or you lay broken in the dust. In 1775, Daniel Boone set out through the Cumberland Gap. The Transylvania Company hired him to blast a path in the rock. They called it the Wilderness Road. Over 35 years, 200,000 souls followed it into Kentucky. Boone himself trusted his own hands more than any distant law. His legendary status amongst frontiersmen earned him special spots on our channel, so be sure to check him out later on. In the meantime, not long after Boone, Black Harris roamed the mountains. He was a free man. He trapped and scouted from the Rockies to the Cascades. He saved lost settlers and led hundreds into the Willamette Valley in 1844. George Washington Bush was among them. He also wrote letters against British schemes in Oregon. Now he lived by one rule: no one tells me where I belong. And that's precisely the type of spirit that lives in America today. But you see, in those times, most of these frontiersmen leaned on God as much as their rifles. Manifest destiny felt like a call. They moved west with Bible in hand. They saw each mile as a chance to spread church and civilization, even when it trampled the land's first keepers. They talked of lone pioneers, but they never walked alone. Neighbors swung hammers at barn raisings. They raised roofs in a day. They came back for camp meetings too, dusty fields full of hymn singers and preachers shouting hope. Those gatherings turned them into something bigger than themselves. They also told tales of Jedediah Smith. Yes, that same hunter, trapper, man of prayer whom we've talked about on our episode on more than one occasion. Rifle in one hand, Bible in the other. He lived by his own laws. Davy Crockett, too, wore his faith into Congress. He fought Jackson's Indian Removal Act. He lost his seat. He died at the Alamo. There was also Kit Carson, another frontier legend who guided wagons across the wild. Cheap novels crowned him hero. We have hours-long episodes on our channel that talk about him too. But yeah, each man out here carried guns, grit, and a quiet faith. Out here, there were no white-coated judges. No print of law. They made rules by campfire glow. A nod, a handshake, a shared cup of coffee meant more than ink on paper. Merit mattered more than pedigree. You earned your place with sweat. And the land was fierce. Winters bit hard. Thieves were everywhere. You needed sharp eyes and quick hands. You had to stand alone, and yet you could not survive alone. You leaned on friends for wood, food, and prayer. That give and take built tight bonds. They leaned on faith in the loneliest places. When nights grew cold and silent, they turned to prayer for comfort. Their belief felt like a shield, proof that their move west was more than chance. It could have been God's work. And out here, people came from everywhere. They learned to live side by side. Customs mixed at campfires. Neighbors swapped stories and tools. No one wore fancy titles. You earned respect by what you did each day. And that gave birth to a rough kind of fairness. Everyone spoke up at town meetings. Decisions came by vote or nod. Still, this drive to expand cut deep into the lives of the first peoples, the indigenous. Their land was taken. Their cultures were lost. Manifest destiny made it seem right. But for those left behind, it spelled loss. However, that old frontier code didn't disappear. On the contrary, it got folded into modern politics and power plays. And frontier values have now found new life in MAGA. Chapter 2. From Pioneer Values to MAGA. After the Civil War, the nation turned its face west. The land spread out far and empty. It carried a promise and a curse. And people came. They met fear on every trail. Some called the natives savages. Others saw brave souls fighting for home. Regardless, American pioneers edged forward. They crossed rivers swollen with spring melt. They huddled by fires under cold stars. A woman in Montana once said they risked their lives at every step. They spoke of scalp dances and wild nights. And in the end, they claimed the land. They called it peace and plenty. Cowboys, on the other hand, told their own stories next. They rode each dawn into orange light. They drove herds across endless plains. Later, they sold their tales in cheap dime novels, and readers back east devoured every word. In 1907, Nat Love, born a slave in Tennessee, wrote his own memoir. As Deadwood Dick, he wrote of rodeos and gunfights. He mixed truth with legend and sold it by the page. But no one spun a yarn like Buffalo Bill. He knew the West wasn't empty. He saw the conquest in every hoofprint. He built his Wild West show as proof, and he filled it with Sioux and Cheyenne riders. They left harsh reservation life behind. They chased buffalo through arena dust. They charged wagons and soldiers for the roar of the crowd. And Bill paid them well. Black Elk, a Sioux man in the show, said Bill had a big heart. Yet Black Elk felt torn. He loved his part of the act, but he hated the white man's story. In that ring, the West cheered its own conquest. At the same moment, a young scholar named Frederick Jackson Turner studied census maps. In 1890, he declared the frontier gone. He imagined a line between wild land and settled towns. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, he said that line shaped the American soul. A tough, curious, restless soul. Turned knew and understood that freedom there sometimes meant no law at all. And when he laid out his big idea, folks listened and heard only the shine. They called Western expansion peaceful, proof the U.S. stood apart from Europe. They forgot the wars, the deals, the land seized. They didn't see how much this young nation acted like old empires. And just weeks after Wounded Knee, General William T. Sherman died in New York. The country spoke of him in grand tones. They praised the man who crushed the Confederacy. But his first fights were down in Florida, chasing Seminoles. Then he joined the Mexican War, riding west with the army to claim California. And after the Civil War, he headed west again. This time he led Sioux and Cheyenne men off their lands and onto reservations. And when Sherman left West Point in 1840, the United States had 26 states. None lay west of Missouri's line. But by 1891, 44 stars shone on the flag all the way to the Pacific. The U.S. had grown into an industrial power. Immigrants poured in, lured by the promise of work. The nation's strength rose on the back of Sherman's battles and on bold moves by federal leaders. They built railroads, banks, and laws to fuel growth. And by the end of Sherman's days, the children of Civil War veterans stood to inherit an empire. How they'd wield that power was theirs to choose. Today, however, historians push back. They know natives weren't mere savages. They know the land was never free. Conquest left scars in soil and memory. For instance, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s swallowed towns whole. Drought and ruin snuck in and out time and again. And in the 1950s and 60s, uranium rushes lit up the West and died just as fast, leaving ghost towns in their wake. Fast forward to today, and you see strong hints of that old frontier in modern MAGA thought. Trump's hardcore backers see themselves as modern pioneers. They praise self-reliance. They scorn the distant swamp of elites. They say their way of life is under attack. Polls show many feel they've lost their country and their roots. They speak of threats from newcomers and changing values. They see politics as a fight for survival. These same voters mix fierce independence with deep doubt of big government. They want taxes low and regulations gone, just like 19th century settlers did. Studies find rural Americans who are key to Trump's base have long felt forgotten by Washington. And that feeling solidified in the 1980s, backed by social conservatism. It drove the Tea Party and kept country voters in the Republican camp even as their towns struggled. Trump didn't create that anger. He only ignited it, turning old frontier stories into today's rallying cry. They hold their guns close. They pray early. They feel the soil under their boots like their own skin. A Pew survey found more than 8 in 10 Trump backers say a gun makes them safer. They fight to keep their rights. Democrats, on the other hand, don't feel that way. Faith runs deep, too. In small churches, they sing old hymns. They see Trump as their protector. He, supposedly, stands for God in a world that seems to be turning away. At least that's what he sold the crowd before he got elected. But the same crowd also talk of a city upon a hill, just as the first settlers did. They point at empty factories and shuttered farms. They call it rural America against coastal elites. And they cast their story in frontier terms. They see themselves as heirs to the old struggle, wood smoke on the wind, wagons creaking over prairie grass. They still carry the myths of Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok. They bind themselves to those lone riders chasing legends. They read Laura Ingalls Wilder and her daughter Rose Wilder Lane. They too warned of big government, of losing the right to stand on your own 2 feet. And so, they distrust anything from far away. Over the years, they've built towns where the sheriff answers to the people, not Washington. They value self-reliance and local rule. They remember that out here, law can be thin, and a man must stand ready to hunt, to pray, and to protect what's his. And they watched the cities grow. Skyscrapers rose where farms once lay. So, rural towns felt left behind. A rift formed between the fields and the towers. And it was that gap which drew in people who longed for old ways. In 2014, Cliven Bundy stood his ground in Nevada. He'd grazed his cattle on public land for years, but the government said he owed fees. He said no. So agents moved in to round up his herd. As a result, hundreds of armed supporters showed up. They pointed rifles at trucks. They blocked the highway. It looked like the West all over again. And in the end, the feds backed down and drove off. And Bundy kept his cattle grazing free. 2 years later, his sons Ammon and Ryan took over an empty refuge in Oregon. They called themselves Citizens for Constitutional Freedom. They held the Malheur Wildlife Refuge for 41 days. They wanted local control of federal land. The siege ended after arrests and a shooting. Then, at trial, a jury cleared the Bundy brothers and their allies. These standoffs remind people that the frontier never really closed. They show how deep the distrust of distant power runs in rural America. But when those values hit the modern stage, they clash with courts and the Capitol. And thereafter, trials start. Pardons fly. Citizen watches form. And this is basically the new frontier battleground. Chapter 3. Trump, Trials, and the Modern Frontier Spirit. The crowd gathers under a wide sky. Flags snap in the wind. Rifles lean against wooden rails. It feels like a frontier outpost. At the center stands a man behind bulletproof glass. He talks of justice and betrayal. He says the courts want to lock him away. He calls himself a pioneer, cornered by a distant power. He promises to free those he calls prisoners of politics. These are the people jailed after the Capitol attack. But in his tale, they are fellow settlers, held by a far-off regime. So he asks his followers to stand guard. He once told them to watch polling places like lookouts on the prairie, and when he heard they carried weapons, he barely flinched. "Let my people in," he said, as if opening a gate to a besieged town. Out west in Colorado, Tina Peters played a part in the same story. She was a county clerk who began to doubt the vote. After a surprising local result, she joined in on the rumors of fraud. She helped break into election machines. She set off alarms about security. And now she's a hero to some, a criminal to others. But in this frontier myth, she's the woman who blew open the gates, revealing secrets or stirring old fears. She walked into the building one night. She handed a man named Conan Hayes a borrowed badge. He slipped past locked doors and then stood before the voting machines, their hard drives exposed. He took the data. She believed she was chasing the truth. Word of the break-in spread fast. A grand jury sat. They heard how she led a MyPillow ally into the system. They listed her crimes, scheming to impersonate an official, trying to sway a public servant, official misconduct. Then, in August 2024, the jury spoke. 7 counts stuck. 4 were felonies. The court said she'd shattered the system's trust. Then October came. A judge named Matthew Barrett spoke harsh words. He said she'd sold snake oil to the public. He gave her 9 years in prison. It was one of the first big sentences for anyone pushing the stolen election story. So yeah, to some, she became a hero. They saw her as a defender at the edge of a wild land. They cheered her stand against a distant power. The Trump team even tried to free her while she appealed. But others saw anarchy. They said she'd rocked faith in the vote, and they feared more would follow her path. But at the same time, her story felt like a frontier tale, a lone figure breaking rules for a cause they believe in. She stayed outside the lines. She paid a heavy price. And to her fans, she proved the old story still lives. The same lone rebel against a far-off ruler, standing tall with nothing but conviction. Even Trump saw himself like Andrew Jackson, a plain man born on the frontier. He liked how Jackson swung open the doors, letting more men vote, pushing against a distant, shady elite. He reached further back to William McKinley's time, when young America pushed beyond its borders, built steel and rail with high tariffs. He even brought back Mount McKinley's old name and promised to stand firm against foreign threats to American jobs. At his January 20th, 2025 inauguration, he spoke of a golden age. He called on manifest destiny, on the grit of revolution. He named Martin Luther King Jr., Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley. He spun them into one grand story of American pride. He even floated talk of taking Greenland and Canada, of reclaiming Panama, memories of old dreams of land and chance. But this wasn't just talk. As I briefly mentioned earlier, in schools and county offices, he stirred calls for citizen patrols, people trained to guard polling sites, a modern Minuteman watch. In June 2024, the GOP rolled out a program. Thousands learned to watch ballots, to stand ready as poll workers and attorneys. They said it was to stop fraud, but it sounded like frontier justice, regular folks taking the law into their own hands. In July, in a Wisconsin primary, a crew of Trump backers slipped into the room where absentee ballots were sorted. They filmed and questioned every vote. Officials said they weren't certified, so police showed them the door. It felt like dress rehearsal for November, and the strings ran deeper still. In 2009, on Lexington Common, Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers bound his followers with a pledge. They swore not to obey orders they called unjust. By 2013, they'd set up citizen preservation teams, local militias ready to fight imagined federal takeover. Before January 6, some cached rifles and ammo in a Virginia hotel, waiting, like mountain men hiding arms when raiders closed in. During the siege, participants told themselves they were the new founding fathers. So they stood their ground, wouldn't back down. They saw a Civil War standoff, a fight against a far-off power. In court, they leaned on that mountain man story. They called themselves Liberty's Defenders. Some got long terms. Others, like Rhodes, won lighter sentences. And that fed a martyr tale. And when Trump returned, he waved a blanket of mercy. On day one, he pardoned every January 6 defendants. Roughly 1,500 were freed, so charges for hurting officers or plotting sedition meant nothing. Experts warned this mercy would glamorize violence. The Post said it broke the rule of law. The Chronicle called it loyalty over justice. Vox argued it used election wins to excuse insurrection. At rallies, ex-rioters spoke like wronged pioneers. They told of betrayal and overreach. CNN found even they didn't know who'd be pardoned. So yeah, the chaos felt like frontier mercy, handed out by a lone sheriff. Scholars said it bent clemency norms past any old record. Meanwhile, the frontiers moved online. Apps like Telegram and Signal became hidden camps. GabChat wooed extremists with no rules. Researchers found over 17,000 Telegram channels on myths and plots. On Parler and Rumble, people live-streamed patrols in Biden counties. They cast voters as intruders on their land. Studies also showed QAnon splintered into small tribes, each staking its claim. The digital world looked like settlers carving plots through unknown land. Yet in both worlds, real and virtual, the same myth runs deep. Mercy turns prisoners into heroes. Messages become land to claim. A small band, they say, can stand against a distant power, and maybe, they believe, reshape the world in their image. So in the end, Frontier Fury never left. It just found new battlegrounds, in our halls, our ballots, our feeds. But how far will it go before it picks its next fight?